Hi guys, welcome to this month's Real English video. In these videos I take you around the city of Edinburgh, tell you about its fascinating history, and you get to enjoy a great English lesson at the same time. This month we are talking about Mary Queen of Scots, one of Scotland's most famous monarchs. So, let's go! Winter of 1542, King James V of Scotland returned to Linlithgow Palace to see his pregnant wife, Queen Marie de Guise. He had just lost a horrendous battle where he'd seen many of his men die, and in the process most likely contracted typhoid or cholera. He was in a terrible state. His wife was really worried about him, but he didn't stay long and moved on to Falkirk Palace, where his fever soon worsened. Queen Marie de Guise was pregnant with their third child. The royal couple had lost two infant sons only a few years earlier, within hours of each other, and the country, who'd previously had the line of succession guaranteed, were in desperate need of another male heir. It was clear that King James was on his deathbed. When the news reached Marie that her husband was desperately ill, she couldn't even go to him because she was in early labour, probably brought on by the state that she saw her husband was in. Eventually, she gave birth on the 8th of December to the new heir of Scotland. But just as the country desperately needed a boy, they got a girl, Mary Queen of Scots. The news reached King James, desperately ill, who is famously rumoured to have said, "It cam with a lass, and it'll gang with a lass," referring to the fact that the Stuart kings had come to power in Scotland through the marriage of a princess, and it would end with the line of a queen. And so begins the incredible story of Mary, Queen of Scots. James V's prediction about the line ending with her didn't come true, but she certainly didn't have an easy life. I like to talk about this story as Scotland's best soap opera, and you'll soon see why. Mary's story is one about treachery, love, politics, war, and destiny. And like with any good soap opera, we have quite a cast of characters that we need to meet to understand the story properly. So, let's do a roll call. First of all, we have Mary, Queen of Scots, the heroine of our tale. Next, we have Elizabeth I, the woman who is constantly pitted against her in the history books. Next up, we have her real enemy, William Cecil, Elizabeth I's first political advisor. Don't forget her second husband, Lord Darnley, and her third husband, the Earl of Bothwell. We also need to mention her son, James VI, who would go on to be one of the most significant and important kings in Scottish history, and finally, one of her closest friends, her personal secretary, David Rizzio. When her father died on the 14th of December, Mary became Queen of Scotland at only 6 years old. Mary's lineage was incredibly important. She was a great niece of Henry VIII, and that put her in the line of succession for the throne of England. Being only a baby, it meant that a regent was needed to govern Scotland until Mary could come of age, and this resulted in a power struggle, with Mary quickly becoming a political football. King Henry VIII also saw opportunities here and arranged a marriage contract for his niece and his son, which did not go down well with the general Scottish public. Long story short, this resulted in a prolonged period of war between Scotland and England known as the Rough Wooing. Marie de Guise, Mary's mother, who was an extremely smart cookie, saw that Mary was being used as a bargaining tool by ambitious men in Scotland, and that the only way to protect her daughter was by getting her out. With her French connections, she was able to secure an incredible marriage to the Dauphin, the Crown Prince of France, and Mary was snuck out of the country. Mary was raised in the French court, but never allowed to forget her Scottish heritage. She was also brought up with a firm belief in divine right as queen, and this is one of the reasons that she would fight so hard to keep her crown, even when everything seemed impossible. Contemporary accounts described her as beautiful, vivacious, and clever. She received an excellent education learning French, Latin, Greek, Spanish, and Italian, as well, of course, as her native Scots. Married at 16, she became Queen Consort of France in 1559. But even in the French court, surrounded by members of her de Guise family, she wasn't safe from the political ambitions of men. In fact, it was her very uncles who strove to claim her right as the real heir to the throne of England rather than Elizabeth I. This would prove to be one of her downfalls in the future. In the continued dramatic story of her life, Mary was widowed at age 18 and by 1560 no longer welcome at the French court. So she took the only decision that she thought she had left: go back to Scotland and claim her crown. On the 19th of August 1561, Mary sailed into Leith docks and landed in a hotbed of religious, factious politics. As a Catholic monarch in a newly Protestant country, Mary had a very fine line to tread. To make matters more complicated, her half-brother, James Stuart, the Earl of Moray, was the leader of the Protestant factions. But instead of imposing her Catholic faith, she allowed everyone to worship as they wished, disappointing the Catholics in Scotland who thought she might champion their cause. In fact, she went so far as to stop a Catholic rebellion in the Highlands. She didn't give up her Catholic faith, but continued to worship privately in her chapel in Holyrood. She chose not to rock the boat, and this was evident when she chose not to really change her political advisors. This was probably also a strategy to help her get into Elizabeth I's good graces. Mary wanted to be named heir presumptive to the English throne because she believed she had the best claim. And she wasn't wrong. Even Elizabeth I went so far as to acknowledge that she could think of no one else who had a better claim. The relationship between Mary and Elizabeth is often portrayed as a negative one, especially with Elizabeth being jealous of Mary's good looks and personality. But despite the way that their relationship's often portrayed, these two female monarchs did not hate each other. They would, of course, go on to have quite a problematic relationship, but initially they were very civil to each other, especially because they had so much in common. They were both stuck between a rock and a hard place. As female monarchs, they had the choice for their line to die with them and they retained their power, or get married, produce an heir, but risk losing their crown and their authority. Mary's real enemy was a man called William Cecil, who was Elizabeth I's political advisor. He was a passionate Protestant who at all costs wanted to avoid Catholic rule. He'd been instrumental in bringing down Mary's mother's regency and continued to thwart Mary's plans at every possible step. When the time came for Mary to find a husband, Cecil decided that she needed a Protestant one. So, to buy time and as a distraction, he sent up a man called Lord Darnley. Darnley was in fact Mary's half-cousin, which meant he also had quite a good claim to the English throne. As a person, he was petulant and politically inept, but very good at hiding it. He was really good looking and charmed Mary with his courtly graces. And perhaps most importantly, he was tall. This was a real change for Mary, who, because of her height, normally towered over men. William Cecil's plan backfired. Mary fell hopelessly in love with Darnley and married him. It's safe to say that Mary had terrible taste in men, and this one was no exception. The choice of her marriage caused a lot of problems. First of all, Elizabeth I was furious that she hadn't been consulted. She was also worried because it strengthened the claim to the English throne. Darnley was a Catholic, which also provoked the Protestant lairds in Scotland. In fact, her half-brother, the Earl of Moray, joined other lairds in open rebellion against her. Mary also brought in more Catholics into her Privy Council, which did nothing to appease this and did nothing to improve her difficult relationship with the preacher John Knox. Mary's bad choices in men would soon come back to haunt her. Darnley turned out to be an arrogant and a drunk, and not happy with his position as king consort was demanding the crown matrimonial. The crown matrimonial would have allowed him to continue to be king and rule Scotland in the event of his wife's death. He and Mary had managed to conceive, and Mary was pregnant, but Darnley's drinking made him increasingly unpleasant and horrible to be around. Darnley then became incredibly jealous of David Rizzio, Mary's friend and private secretary. He convinced himself that Rizzio was the real father of Mary's child. When Mary was 6 months pregnant, Darnley and his supporters stormed her private apartments at Holyrood Palace, which you can see here behind me, and stabbed Rizzio in front of Mary 57 times. While all of this was going on, Mary's enemies were also busy trying to find a way to get her and Darnley off the throne and put her exiled Protestant half-brother on the throne. In fact, the Earl of Moray, remember that's Mary's Protestant half-brother, it's confusing, I know, was allowed back to Scotland and given his old job on the Privy Council despite having openly rebelled against her. Mary was losing control. And then she gave birth to a boy. James VI of Scotland was born here in Edinburgh Castle in 1566 on the 19th of June. This had a lot of implications because now Scotland had a male heir to the throne, and potentially so did England. However, Mary's marriage was essentially over. Unsurprisingly, seeing your best friend being murdered by your husband does nothing for your relationship. Something had to be done about the Darnley problem. Some historians think that Mary had just planned to imprison him for life, forget about him, but a more permanent solution needed to be found. Darnley had been lodging at a place called Kirk of Fields, where I am now, except nowadays it houses the National Museum of Scotland. Mary visited him daily, so it looked like a reconciliation was in progress. On the night of the 9th of February 1567, Mary visited her husband in the evening and later went to a wedding celebration of a member of her household. In the early hours of the morning, an explosion devastated Kirk of Field. Darnley's body was found dead in the garden, apparently suffocated. This murder would prove to be the end of Mary's reign. But more about that next time. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss a video, and we'll see you next time for Mary Queen of Scots Part 2.